David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 27, Tommy Traddles. It may have been a consequence of Mr. Crupp's advice, and perhaps for no better reason than because there was a certain similarity in the sound of the words Skittles and Traddles, that it came into my head next day to go and look after Traddles. He lived in a little street near the veterinary college at Camden Town, which was principally tenanted, as one of our clerks who lived in that direction informed me, by gentlemen students who brought live donkeys and made experiments on them in their apartments. I found the street was not as desirable a one as I could have wished it to be for the sake of Traddles. The inhabitants appeared to have a propensity to throw any little trifles that were not in want into the road. They were not in want of into the road, which not only made it rank and sloppy, but untidy too, on account of the cabbage leaves. The refuse was not wholly vegetable either, for I myself saw a shoe, a doubled-up saucepan, a black bonnet, and an umbrella in various stages of decomposition, as I was looking out for the number I wanted. The general air of the place reminded me forcibly of the days when I lived with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber, an indescribable character of faded gentility that attached to the house I sought, and made it unlike all the other houses in the street, though they were all built in one momentous pattern, reminded me still more of Mr. and Mrs. Micawber. Happening to arrive at the door as it was opened that afternoon, I was reminded of Mr. and Mrs. Micawber more forcibly yet. "Now," said the milkman to a youthful servant girl, "that there has a little bill of mine been heerd on?" "Oh, master says he'll attend to it immediate," was the reply. "Because," said the milkman, going on as if he had received no answer, and speaking, as I judged from his tone, rather for the edification of somebody within the house than of the youthful servant, an impression which was strengthened by his manner of glaring down the passage, "because that there little bill has been running so long that I began to believe it's run away altogether and never won't be heerd of. Now, I'm not a-going to stand it, you know," said the milkman, still throwing his voice into the house and glaring down the passage. The voice of the youthful servant became faint, but she seemed to me, from the action of her lips again, to murmur that it would be attended immediate. "I tell you what," said the milkman, looking hard at her for the first time, and taking her by the chin. "Are you fond of milk?" "Yes, I likes it," she replied. "Good," said the milkman. "Then you won't have none tomorrow, do you hear? Not a fragment of milk you won't have tomorrow." I thought she seemed, upon the whole, relieved by the prospect of having any today. The milkman, after shaking his head at her darkly, released her chin, and, with anything rather than goodwill, opened his can and deposited the usual quantity in the family jug. This done, he went away muttering, and uttered a cry of his trade next door in a vindictive shriek. When I got to the top of the stairs, the house was only a story high above the ground floor. Traddles was on the landing to meet me. He was delighted to see me and gave me welcome with great heartiness to his little room. It was in the front of the house and extremely neat, though sparsely furnished. It was his only room I saw, for there was a sofa bedstead in it, and his blacking brushes and blacking were among his books on the top shelf behind a dictionary. His table was covered with papers, and he was hard at work in an old coat. In a corner of the room was something neatly covered with a large white cloth. I could not make out what. "Traddles," said I, shaking hands with him again, after I sat down, "I am delighted to see you." "I am delighted to see you, Copperfield," he returned. "I am very glad indeed to see you. It was because I was thoroughly glad to see you when we met in Ely Place, and was sure you were thoroughly glad to see me, that I gave you this address instead of my address at Chambers." "Oh, you have Chambers," said I. "Why, I have the fourth of a room and a passage, and the fourth of a clerk," returned Traddles. "Three others and myself unite to have a set of chambers, to look business-like, and we quarter the clerk, too. £0.50 a week it cost me." His old simple character and good temper, and something of his very unlucky fortune also, I thought, smiled at me in the smile with which he made this explanation. "It's not because I have the least pride, Copperfield, you understand," said Traddles, "that I don't usually give my address here. It's only on account of those who come to me who might not like to come here. For myself, I am fighting my way on in the world against difficulties, and it would be ridiculous if I made a pretense of doing anything else." "You are reading for the bar?" Mr. Waterbrook informed me, said I. "Why, yes," said Traddles, rubbing his hands slowly over one another. "I am reading for the bar. The fact is, I have just begun to keep my terms, after rather a long delay. It's some time since I was articled, but the payment of that £100 was a great pull, said Traddles with a wince, as if he had had a tooth out. "You were brought up by an uncle," said I. "Yes. He was retired, what do you call it, draper, cloth merchant, and had made me his heir, but he didn't like me when I grew up." "Did you get nothing, Traddles, after all?" "Oh, dear, yes," said Traddles. "I got £50. I had never been brought up into any profession, and at first I was at a loss what to do for myself. However, I began to copy law writings that didn't answer very well, and then I began to state cases for them and make abstracts and do that sort of work. Well, that put it in my head to enter myself as a law student, and that ran away with all that was left of the £50. I was fortunate enough, too, to become acquainted with a person in the publishing way, who was getting up an encyclopedia, and he set me to work, and indeed, glancing at his table, I am at work for him at this minute. I am not a bad compiler, Copperfield, said Traddles, preserving the same air of cheerful confidence in all he said. But I have had no invention at all, not a particle. I suppose there never was a young man with less originality than I have. As Traddles seemed to expect that I should assent to this, as a matter of course, I nodded, and he went on with the same sprightly patience. I came to find no better expression as before. "So, by little and little, and not living highly, I managed to scrape up the £100 at last," said Traddles, "and thank heaven that's paid, though it certainly was," said Traddles, wincing again, as if he had had another tooth out. "A pull. Now, Copperfield, it's so pleasant to see you that I shan't conceal anything. Therefore, you must know that I am engaged." "Engaged? Oh, Dora." "She is a curate's daughter," said Traddles. "One of 10, down in Devonshire. A little older than me, but the dearest girl. I told you I was going out of town. I have been down there. I walked there and I walked back, and I had the most delightful time. I dare say, ours is likely to be a rather long engagement, but our motto is, wait and hope. We always say that. Wait and hope, we always say, and she would wait, Copperfield, till she was 60, any age you can mention, for me." Traddles rose from his chair, and with a triumphant smile, put his hand upon the white cloth I had observed. "However," he said, "it's not that we haven't made a beginning toward housekeeping. No, we have begun. We must get on by degrees. But we have begun here," drawing the cloth off with great pride and care, "are 2 pieces of furniture to commence with. This flower pot and stand she bought herself. You put that in a parlour window," said Traddles, falling a little back from it to survey it with the greater admiration, "with a plant in it, and there you are. This little round table with the marble top, it's 2 feet 10 in circumference, I bought. You want to lay a book down, you know, or somebody comes to see you and wants a place to stand a cup of tea upon, and there you are again," said Traddles. "It's an admirable piece of workmanship, firm as a rock." I praised them both highly, and Traddles replaced the covering as carefully as he had removed it. "In the meantime," said Traddles, coming back to his chair, "and this is the end of my prosing about myself, I get on as well as I can. I don't make much, but I don't spend much in general. I board with the people downstairs, who are very agreeable people indeed. Both Mr. and Mrs. Micawber have seen a great deal of life and are excellent company." "My dear Traddles!" I quickly exclaimed. "What are you talking about?" Traddles looked at me as if he wondered what I was talking about. "Mr. and Mrs. Micawber," he repeated. "Why, I am intimately acquainted with them." An opportune double knock at the door, which I knew well from old experience at Windsor Terrace, resolved any doubt in my mind, as to their being my old friends. I begged Traddles to ask his landlord to walk up. Traddles accordingly did so over the banister, and Mr. Micawber, not a bit changed, his tights, his stick, his shirt collar, and his eyeglass, all the same as ever, came into the room with a genteel and youthful air. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Traddles," said Mr. Micawber, with the old roll in his voice. He checked himself in humming a soft tune. "I was not aware that there was any individual alien to this tenement in your sanctum." Mr. Micawber slightly bowed to me and pulled up his shirt collar. "How do you do, Mr. Micawber?" said I. "Sir," said Mr. Micawber, "you are exceedingly obliging. I am in statu quo." "And Mrs. Micawber?" I pursued. "Sir," said Mr. Micawber, "she is also, thank God, in statu quo." "And the children, Mr. Micawber?" "Sir," said Mr. Micawber, "I rejoice to reply that they are likewise in the enjoyment of salubrity." All this time Mr. Micawber had not known me in the least, though he had stood face to face with me, but now, seeing me smile, he examined my features with more attention, fell back, cried, "Is it possible? Have I the pleasure of beholding Copperfield?" and shook me by both hands with the utmost fervour. Good heaven, Mr. Traddles," said Mr. Micawber, "to think that I should find you acquainted with the friend of my youth, the companion of my earlier days, my dear," calling over the banister to Mrs. Micawber, while Traddles looked with reason, not a little amazed at this description of me. "Here is the gentleman in Mr. Traddles' apartment whom he wishes to have the pleasure of presenting to you, my love." Mr. Micawber immediately reappeared and shook hands with me again. "You find us, Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, with one eye on Traddles, "at present established on what may be designated as a small and unassuming scale. But you are aware that I have, in the course of my career, surmounted difficulties and conquered obstacles. You are no stranger to the fact that there have been periods of my life when it has been requisite that I should pause until certain expected events should turn up, when it has been necessary that I should fall back before making what I trust I shall not be accused of presumption in terming a spring. This present is one of those momentous stages in the life of man. You find me falling back for a spring, and I have every reason to believe that a vigorous leap will shortly be the result." I was expressing my satisfaction when Mrs. Micawber came in, a little more slatternly than she used to be, or so she seemed now, to my unaccustomed eyes, but still with some preparation of herself for company, and with a pair of brown gloves on. "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, leaning toward her, "here is a gentleman of the name of Copperfield, who wishes to renew his acquaintance with you." It would have been better, as it turned out, to have led gently up to his announcement, for Mrs. Micawber, being in a delicate state of health, was overcome by it, and was taken so unwell that Mr. Micawber was obliged, in great trepidation, to run down to the water-butt and draw a basin to lave her brow with. She presently revived, however, and was really pleased to see me. Mr. Micawber was very anxious that I should stay to dinner. I should not have been averse to do so, but that I imagined I detected trouble and calculation relative to the extent of the cold meat in Mr. Micawber's eye. I therefore pleaded another engagement, and observing that Mrs. Micawber's spirits were immediately lightened, I resisted all persuasion to forego it. But I told Traddles and Mr. and Mrs. Micawber that before I could think of leaving, they must appoint a day when they would come and dine with me. An appointment was made for the purpose that suited us well, and I took my leave. And that is the end of chapter 27.